Well, let's talk about something controversial because since I'm kind of a unique type of guy anyway, we might as well keep the controversy going, right? So, someone, and I recognize the person, they've been a subscriber of mine for a long time, but really been following the channel, was commenting on the video that I dropped yesterday, and we got into some interesting conversation. Now, this is something that I haven't really dove into too much. And that's why I said, hey, let's open up the controversy. White privilege. Is it real? Does it exist? And if it does, where does it exist? That's what I want to talk about today. So I'll start by saying this. Do I believe that there is some sort of white privilege out there? Yes. I won't say there's absolutely none in existence. There is. Now, is it the type that I believe most people try to lead us to believe there is? No, not in my opinion. Is there this blanket that all white people have a step up in the world? I don't agree with that. Now, if we're talking about potential encounters with police and whatnot, you may have a step up over some person of color. Okay? But I don't think that's simply because you're white necessarily. It's because of a societal standard, in my opinion, that has been put onto the different races over a period of time. If you interpret a certain person with being more dangerous off an appearance, even if that appearance is their race, you tend to become more cautious, which leads to tension and other things. That's been a huge problem with the police and minorities for a long period of time. We have had this engraved into our society, and that's because of poor standards of living, poor education system, blah, blah, blah. We could go down the reasons why. But a lot of people have associated crime with people of color. And so because of that, people also then put that caution flag up when they look or see someone who they believe fits that bill. And that goes for pretty much everyone. There's pretty much, you got the heavy Christian folks out there of all colors who could look at someone dressed, emo or goth, and they're going to, oh, it's a devil worshiper. Maybe they're not. But it's going to be the immediate assumption. There's been other tests where people have actually gone out in public and tried this. An Arab guy did a test. He put a suit on, okay, just dressed like a normal man. Okay, you'd see walking down the street, maybe a businessman, and dropped a book bag at someone's foot. And they just looked at him like, can I help you? But then he put on the garb, the gown, the headdress, did the same thing to someone else. They ran for their lives. Why? Because they associated, okay, guy dressed like this, tan skin, throwing book bag at my foot, he just threw a bomb at me. They react different ways. You don't have to think it's right. Just understand that's how most people's brains work. So when we're talking about police, they're not going to be any different. They're not aliens. They're not superhuman. They're going to react in a similar way. So, yes, there might be a benefit to being white when you get pulled over, but it's because of the way society has programmed us to treat the different races. So that is an area where I will admit there is more than likely a white privilege there. Statistics show there is one, okay? However, that's not the white privilege that bothers me when I hear it being said. I'm willing to admit when I see there's an issue, and that's an area where I do see it. Where do we get into the weeds with this whole white privilege thing? Because certain people want to pretend that if you're simply white, your entire world is going to be naturally better than a person of colors. Now, I don't believe that. I simply don't. If that were the case, you'd have nothing but white people living well off, And it would be all people of color who are in poverty, with maybe the few exceptions, right? That's not true. That's not true. And so the guy who was going back and forth with me, he was arguing because I mentioned to him he actually got into the Asian community, for example. Okay, and clearly, even the status quo, who's created systems like affirmative action, believe that the Asian American community has come so far that white people need more of a handicap to the Asian community. So what we were arguing about was, I said, okay, look, I said more Asian people are more likely to wind up with college education, good job, and they make more money on average than white families. So how are you going to tell me I got white privilege over an Asian person? Okay? Even affirmative action, like Steven Crowder or not, he brought up good points. If you research him, he's correct here. Okay? A black person would have to score here to get into some of these colleges thanks to affirmative action, right? Whereas the white person would have to score here to get into that college based on affirmative action. But the Asian has to score here. So what they're saying is that the Asian community has actually come so far that white people who are supposed to have white privilege now need the handicap to compete with them in the intellectual category. Well, his argument was that, okay, yeah, sure, they might get all of that, but they don't make it to positions of power. How come you don't see more Asian politicians? How come you don't see more Asian CEOs, he brought up, right? That there's a glass ceiling and they're not being allowed to break through it by white people, basically, was the accusation. Okay? So when I brought that up to him, I was like, not really. Well, the example he threw right back at me was, we'll look at Silicon Valley. It's mostly consisting of Asian folks. So if it mostly consists of Asian folks, why aren't there more Asian CEOs in Silicon Valley? How come it's all white people? Problem with the argument there, dude. Google is the biggest tech company in the entire world. And the CEO ain't white. He ain't black either. No, he's Indian. He's an Indian guy. And not just like Indian descent born here. No. He was born in India, moved here, still worked his way up a ladder, and became CEO of the biggest tech company in the world, Google. So if white people had the lock on the grasp of Silicon Valley, how come not even a person of minority descent that was actually born in America didn't wind up with a job? Much less the white guy. White guy didn't get it. White guy might have had it once upon a time. He ain't got it now. And it wasn't even someone who was born here. No. This guy was born in another country, moved here, and worked his way that far up the ladder. So if this white privilege existed in the workplace to the level that so many people act like it did, how did that happen exactly? Because you wouldn't think that would happen, especially if the whole community is made up of so many Asians. Now, just for the record, okay, a lot of people want to throw, it's from India. When most people think of Asian, they think of China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, things like that, right? Except we were talking about Asians, and guess what? It turns out India is a part of Asia. So he was born in India, which means he was born in Asia, which means he's actually Asian, and he's the CEO of the largest tech company in the world, and yet you're telling me there's a glass ceiling there they can't break through. How the fuck did that happen? So again, makes no sense. Furthermore than that, if we're going to examine this whole white privilege thing, the people that are in this stereotype of white privilege are white families who've had money for generations, most of the time. The majority of white people that comes to mind when you hear the term white privileges are the Kens and the Karens. They live in the suburbs. Okay, the suburbs. They eat fine wine or drink fine wine, eat fine cuisine, break out the caviar, swig the champagne, drive a new Cadillac, drive a new Mercedes. They've got the money, right? They're the doctors, they're the psychiatrists. Excuse me, they're the lawyers. Okay, they've had money, most likely for a while. Because they had money, they were able to transfer that down to the next generation. So when they had kids, they took that money and they took that wealth and they made sure that those kids became spoiled most of the time. They made sure they got education. They made sure they might have gotten private tutoring if they needed it. They made sure they went to college, made sure they went to good college, made sure they got the degrees, this and that. And then those kids wind up going out into the world and getting those other jobs and whatnot and living that life. They wear polo, they live in the suburbs, and they've had the money, and they've had the money for a long time. Whereas when you look at actual blue-collar, poor white families, they're not breaking out of this bubble. Like, if white privilege was a thing, you could be born white, being poor, and it would be nothing at all. They just break right out of that and become a success, right? And sure, some people do, but guess what? Some people of color do the same thing. But statistically speaking, I've watched what happened in blue-collar America. You know why? Because I was born in it. I've lived here my whole life. I've seen what's happened around me. And do you know how many people that don't live in these big cities or Silicon Valley or all these places that a lot of people on the left like to point to, like New York, California, and all these other places, and point to, oh, see how they live? And it's all the white people. You're white privilege. You know how people actually live, in a lot of cases, through here? Let me tell you what my experience was. Okay? How many people here had to ever eat a mayonnaise sandwich growing up? Know what that is? That's literally some good old white bread. Pick your brand. I think when I was a kid it was Sunbeam, maybe. Sunbeam bread. And Duke's mayonnaise. That's it. That's it. Just take you some sandwich bread, rub some mayonnaise across it, and boom. There you go. That was your food. Saltine crackers, sardines. Cut little potatoes up and just fry them in a pan and eat things like that. Fried in corn oil, by the way. Okay? That's not exactly what I would call privileged when you're not even getting sandwich meat to go in. Oh, and if you got sandwich meat, let's just be clear. We're not talking a lot of turkey. We're not talking roast beef. We're talking bologna and Spam. If you had sandwich meat. Fried Spam sandwich. You know what Spam is made out of? That's not what I would call privilege. At all. You're not eating fine cuisine. You know what else isn't privilege? When you didn't have a lot of toys around to play with, so as a kid, you want to play, you get creative, you use, as Barney would have said, your imagination, and you play with fucking sticks. Sticks. Little branches that broke off of trees. Make it into a toy gun because couldn't have one. That's fucking privilege. That's not privilege, man. At all. South Carolina gets really fucking hot in the summertime. Okay? I don't know that today I could stand to live the way I did when I was a kid growing up at my aunt's house. Because I actually have got air conditioning in my house. Oh, and by the way, they didn't give it to me because I was white. This is a result of having to bust my ass and pay my bills. And bust my ass enough to have this, but not have health insurance, by the way, because I can keep Loctiting my wounds shut and whatnot, but I'd much rather have a roof over my head. So when I was a kid growing up in a Mill Hill house, and I'm going to put it up on the screen right here so people can see it as well. I'm going to let you see what this house looked like. Okay? Now, they finally got a window unit air conditioner in this house years after I lived there. You know what we had to stay cool with in the summer in the middle of this South Carolina humid, hot-ass summertime we get around here? You know what we had? Fans. Box fans. Little round fans that sit on the floor. Let me tell you what my aunt used to do during the summertime for staying cool. This is Southern ingenuity right here, okay? This is what poor people do when they don't have air conditioning. You ever seen those little Japanese fans? People fan out and they do this? We didn't have that. Let me tell you what she would do. She would take a cardboard box. She would cut a little piece of that cardboard off, get her about a square about yay big. Okay? Take that piece of cardboard and fan with it. That's privilege. You don't have air conditioning. You're sitting there keeping yourself cool like that. That's fucking privilege. Because, I mean, we were all white. If white privilege existed to the manner most people say it does, why was that happening? See, you're not talking to the typical YouTuber right now who's repeating the things we hear out of mainstream media, repeating the things that some college professor has told a classroom full of kids who didn't grow up this way either, okay? You're actually talking to a guy who grew up that way. And these stereotypes about these Kens and the Karens, again, people who have money because their parents more than likely had money. But I got news for you. That happens with a lot of families of all colors. It just so happens that there's more white families across the country who that's happening with because at one point in time minorities were held more down, and so therefore there were more white people who had that wealth from way back when. Minorities had to get that later on. So that means there's fewer of them who have it. But it's not like that's actively still the case today. There's, of course, certain exceptions. But it's not white people across the board. What this is, in actuality, is a rich privilege. If your parents were rich and your ancestors have been rich, you're going to be more likely to turn out at least kind of well off yourself. Unless you go absolutely bonkers and just squander all your money like a party animal, which is possible. Like I said, there are some exceptions. But it's not that, oh, well, you're white, you're grandfathered into being rich. Not the case. Not the case. And I can speak to that from personal experience, not just for myself, but other people that I've watched around me growing up. It's just not true. And all these examples people want to point to when we get into California, New York, all these different little big city havens all across the country, that ain't a representation of the Rust Belt. That ain't what blue collar America looks like. That's not what we called when I was growing up the Mill Hill. By the way, grew up on the Mill Hill. I lived on the Mill Hill. I know what one is like, what it's like to live there. So see, and that's what I told this guy. None of you have ever lived on the Mill Hill. And you probably don't know very much about Mill Hill. Most of you may not have even heard that term up until this point. So let me elaborate on what the Mill Hill means. Where did it get the name the Mill Hill? So these were houses built for blue-collar families because within that community, at each one of them, there was a cotton mill, also known as a textile plant. They would leave work and come home, usually with lint, white lint and cotton lint and crap all over them. I saw my aunt come home that way many times. Okay? They were called mill hills because it's kind of on a hill. There's a mill right there, and most people didn't even have to drive. They just walked to work. Mill Hill housing. That's where I grew up. So I can speak from experience. And not a lot of people know what that's like, living in that kind of environment or living in that kind of neighborhood. And you want to talk about this white privilege based off stereotypes that you've heard from college professors, documentaries, CNN and the mainstream media. You want to talk about these things, but you've never gotten away from your social media bubble to actually come here, live a day in this life, and then tell me what it's like. To live with one of those poor white families who ought to have a whole lot of privilege, right? You don't do that. You keep going on your talking points. You listen to indie media who tells you there's this big problem with white privilege. You listen to documentaries who tells you there's a big problem with it. You listen to all these different things. But what you've never physically done is went and put yourself in the shoes, I guarantee you. If you did, you'd find out there's a reason why there's a difference between the facts and what the books tell you. So you've actually got to walk a mile in these boots before you understand just how rough it gets. Now, to be fair, I've never walked a day in an actual minority's boots either. But I know when I hear about a lot of the issues as far as how you live, not necessarily with the racial discrimination aspect, no, I can't relate to that. But when we talk about living standards and things of that nature, when we talk about what you had to eat and things like that, guess what? I can relate. Now, how's that possible if white people are grandfathered in because of white privilege? Wouldn't be. Wouldn't be. But guess what? It happens. Happened to me growing up. And it can happen to other white people growing up. Even today, it could still happen. Which in turn means, is there really the kind of white privilege a lot of people want to paint that there is? Sure, there's a type, but I don't know that the impression most people want to give about white privilege is true, because I don't buy it. You know why? Because I've lived in the shoes of a white person and know what I grew up in. And what you're pretty much saying white people don't encounter, I've encountered. Been there, lived it. Didn't exactly enjoy it. It's not exactly fun to be sweating your ass off in the middle of the summertime because you've got no air conditioning. It's not exactly fun when you really want a lot more food, but you had to eat bread and mayonnaise. But I've been there. I've done that. And so when you tell me that when I'm making $30,000 to $40,000 a year, that I'm more privileged than a guy sitting on his ass, probably inside of some air-conditioned building, not working outside most of the day like I do, by the way, okay? Sitting inside in an air-conditioned building, making anywhere from about $80,000 to $100,000 a year. I'm more privileged because I'm white, even though he's making more money. But the reason he's not as privileged is because, yeah, he's making a lot of money, but he's not a CEO. So I'll finish off on that one little point because I found that one very interesting. And again, CEO of the largest tech company isn't a white guy. It's not a white guy. That's just the case. Remember, he's Asian. He's born in India. Okay? But the argument was, well, why haven't more Asians become CEOs of some of these other companies? So, okay, we'll look at Silicon Valley, right? Facebook. Started by a white guy. within the last 30 years. Guess what? The white man's still alive. Mark Zuckerberg isn't dead. So why exactly would somebody else, regardless of nationality, have control of the company unless he decided to step down? No, he started it and he's still alive. So your argument that an Asian should have become the CEO of Facebook, even though they haven't removed him as CEO and he's not dead and hasn't decided to step himself down, how does that make any sense? Same goes for Twitter. I mean, until these people who created them step down, no one is going to take over that mantle, and it doesn't matter what nationality. Now, your argument would actually have some weight to it if these people had gone through multiple CEOs over the years and every single one had been a white man, including, let's say they just swapped 3 CEOs in the last decade. But that ain't the case. One, a lot of these social media companies who consist and make up a lot of Silicon Valley haven't been around that long. Therefore, they haven't had that many CEOs. And in most cases, their CEO is still the person who created the platform. Just so happens it was a white guy. But again, I refer back to the biggest tech company being Google, and their CEO is not a white guy. But you're going to tell me that because someone, white, Asian, black, whatever, anybody but a white person, and we, as this person said themselves, Silicon Valley does not mostly consist, as far as who makes up the population, of white people. So you're going to tell me, though, that because I'm white, making a fraction of what they make a year, I'm still more privileged simply because I'm white. When I guarantee you, they're probably making enough to maybe have some health insurance and probably still have a standard living. Oh, and remember, they're not working outside in the elements all day long either to get the money that they got. That's over double what I might be making. But I'm the privileged one here, right? So yeah, people have got to get over this entitled, oh, woe is me mentality. Okay? Yes, the system does not work well for those down here trying to get up here. And most people associate, well, that's only for people of color. I haven't become the CEO of anything yet. I wasn't even able to get all the way to college because when I graduated high school, I had to start working and making money to support myself. And furthermore than that, not only did I have to do that, I had to do it with multiple jobs. At one point, I had 3 of them. 3 jobs. Busting my ass. Doing it the old-fashioned way to get the things that I have today. Just like people had to do a long time ago. You know why? Because I knew what it was like growing up. I knew how uncomfortable it was, and I wanted to try to fight to get something better. So that's the case. You know what? A lot of people of color have done the same thing. Don't even sit there and tell me, well, the reason you were able to do that is because you were white. Then explain to me how there's been people of color who've done the exact same thing. Now, we could argue how many people of color have done it versus how many white people have done it. And again, perhaps in that particular area, as far as who winds up actually breaking through some kind of glass ceiling, perhaps that there is a disproportionate amount of white people who do it. Again, I don't think it's just because they're white. I think it's because of the current education system that affects the areas where people of color go to school, their living environment. But by no means is it just a people of color issue. There are white people who go through the same thing. And so therefore, if there are white people who go through the same thing, then how come white privilege isn't applying there? That means, again, it's not a white privilege, it's a rich privilege. If you were already grandfathered into having money from birth, you're going to be more likely to keep that standard of living going forward. If you were grandfathered into poverty from birth, you're going to have a hard time breaking out of that category. And again, that's not a white privilege. It's a rich privilege. There's a difference between the two. And it's time we stop pretending that it's all because of the color of somebody's skin. No, it's got a lot to do with your circumstances, your environment, your surroundings, and how you were brought up from a young age. That impacts a lot of how you turn out. Just saying.